How's it going, folks? Brian Cusco here at Triple B. Today's guest is author of the Boa Bible and friend of the show, Mr. Vin Russo. It's not actually called the Bible, it's called the Complete Boa Constrictor, but it's been hailed as the Boa Bible. Vin is always a great guy to have on. He's easy to talk to, always full of lots of useful information, and we get to look at some cool snakes too. So if you're into all that kind of stuff, well, you came to the right place. You're watching Triple B TV.
A revision of the Complete Boa, a new one, because the old one went out of print.
Okay. Oh, it went out of print?
Yeah, it's sold out.
Oh, I'm glad I have a copy then.
Yeah, it's gone. It's gone, yeah.
Dang. That's so it's going to start going up in value then, people who have copies.
They're on Amazon for $400.
No kidding.
No. 400 and something bucks, yeah.
Oh, no, you're serious?
I'm dead serious, yeah. I was very surprised.
Wow.
Yeah. One guy said he saw one for $1,000. I don't know if that's true or not.
400 is still pretty up there for a book.
Now it's a collectible book.
Yeah, I guess it's happening when it goes out of print, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's a revision. You're taking, I guess, doing new research, pulling from new spots to update.
What we're doing, we completely update the book. Specifically the taxonomic section, taxonomy, because in the last, I'd say, 5-6 years, some DNA sequencing was done on boas, and a group of PhDs who are herpetologists collected a very large group of animals from the wild and from private collections that had provenance in particular places in South America, Central America. And what they did was they compared the DNA of all these different animals to each other and concluded that instead of 9 subspecies of boas, we currently have 3 species of boa from Mexico to Argentina.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. So there's all kinds of tidbits like that are going to be in the book. Right?
Yeah. So that'll be in the book, and we'll go into detail as to, how they came to that conclusion and what all the new different species are. And I'm also going to talk about in the book subspecies, because even though there originally were 9 subspecies, you got to keep in mind there's, when people did their that taxonomic classes in school, you figured out the genus, species, subspecies. Remember the little chart you had? So in boas, the genus is Boa, the species is Constrictor or Imperator, but now it's Constrictor and Imperator are their own species. There's the subspecies part's going to change. So for example, Boa Constrictor will be Boa Constrictor.
I've heard about that like a year and a half ago at least. I heard mention of that they were going to get rid of the Constrictor and then because it's redundant basically.
Right, and then you had Boa Constrictor Imperator. Those are Boa Imperator. So the Constrictor is dropped from the Imperators, and the Constrictor is just Constrictor on the true red tails. Right. So I'll clarify it all in the book, and people can eventually read it, and I'll take the science and put it into layman's terms for people
the reasoning
to grasp.
Behind the
reasoning behind it, and like I said, with going back to the subspecies, I talked to the PhDs that did this paper, and I said, what are we going to do now with Boa Constrictor longicauda, Boa Constrictor,
occidentalis,
sabigay, all this stuff, and they said what's going to happen is, for example, I'm going to use one example because I can go into 10, but one example is Boa Constrictor ortoni, which is Peru, the west coast of Peru. That's now most likely going to be Boa Imperator ortoni, because they proved that Imperator is the dominant race that's on the west side of the Andes Mountains. It's not Constrictor. Constrictor are the true red tails, which are on the east side of the Andes Mountains. So I said, what about occidentalis? Well, that'll most likely be Boa Constrictor occidentalis. It won't change. It'll still be Constrictor.
Even though it's like not on either side.
Right. Or that one herpetologist in the study had given a little clue or a hint that it may be another species, because it was quite different from constrictor. So they didn't do enough yet in the outer edges of all of the ranges. So that'll probably be another paper later on, and maybe there'll be another revision of the book that'll be done in 10 years. Who knows? I don't know. How many times am I going to do it? The Complete Boa Constrictor is the first book. The second one will be the more Complete Boa Constrictor, or maybe we'll change the title. I don't know yet. What's the next one going to be? The most complete Boa Constrictor? You can't keep going,
The almost complete.
Yeah, we're almost there, I had enough. I'm done. This is the Complete Boa,
The never-ending Boa.
It could be, yeah. Well, it's with taxonomy and DNA's changed the whole footprint of everything we look at,
sure.
even in all animals.
Right.
Because you got to keep in mind, if you go back 100 years, when people
There's a lot of technology.
first were taxonomically studying all creatures, even more further, 200-300 years back to Darwin was doing it, and then Linnaeus, who did the first categorizing of species of animals. That was in the 1700s. They only could do it by looking at them.
Right.
There was no other way of deciding or deciphering what was different. And what we're learning now, which is amazing to me, is we're seeing animals that look completely differently from each other, but DNA-wise, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And the way that occurs is, evolutionary-wise, these animals evolve in different microclimates or different areas of the world, even though they're the same species and share the same common ancestor. They've evolved separately, but by evolving in a different environment, they've changed to adapt to that environment.
That's a big thing with DNA, not the genetics, is that what we're learning is that genetics is not just something, you're not born with this set thing of genetics and that's what you've got for the rest of your life. Your environment turns on genes or turns off genes. And,
right, again, I'm going to always say, for example, a darker snake evolved in a darker environment. So it was more advantageous to be darker, not to be eaten by predators.
Right.
So that dark gene, let's call it melanin, was more prevalent in those areas. So those snakes got darker, like Occidentalis are really dark.
Right.
A light snake may not have survived in their environment. Maybe it gets too cold and they can't absorb enough heat. There's so many compensating factors.
One of the coolest things I saw with that recently of environment and changing a snake and creating it how it is, there's this viper in somewhere in the Middle East, somewhere in the Middle East, and it's got, you may have seen it, it's like this spider on its tail, like these little things come off, it wiggles its tail around, and it looks like a spider moving around.
Yes, yeah.
And just thinking about how that started, like it, maybe the first snakes was like one snake had a little white dot on his tail or something,
right.
and that snake got more food.
And he learned to wave it around to attract something.
And then eventually, like another little baby was born with like a little piece coming off, and then eventually, over who knows, millions of years, it became this spider.
Right, a spider. Tail. Yeah. Well, even boas. Nobody knows why boas have that red tail, and I've seen little baby red-tailed boas doing the quarter lures with their tails and when they're really young, not older ones, obviously. So it's like, was that what it was for?
And maybe it's evolving out because they don't use it anymore, but they still got the red?
I don't know. And then while I was in the Amazon basin, I saw these I guess you could call them orchids. They were a type of flowers growing up, epiphytic flowers growing up in the trees, and they had like triangular red flowers that if you put them all in a row, it looked like the side of a red-tailed boa. And I remember the first time I saw that, I'm like, maybe they're trying to look like they're a cryptic orchid hiding in a tree. I don't know,
And maybe what they eat is something that's attracted to those flowers.
Exactly, it comes near there, yeah.
That's cool stuff. I love stuff like this.
I love evolution.
Yeah.
It's the one thing that's geared me mostly towards getting involved with boas and breeding and captive breeding and preserving these bloodlines that I have in captivity,
Speaking of bloodlines in captivity, you think we should take a look at some of these?
Yeah, there's one here that will kind of fit into what we're talking about with evolution. Many years ago, a friend of mine who works with a bunch of, I work with a lot of PhDs, and so do some of my colleagues. We work with people that go into the field and collect snakes. They're herpetologists. They got their PhDs on, one of my friends got his PhD dissertation on island boas, Dr. Scott Boback. My friend Gus Renfro works with a lot of scientists and PhDs, field herping PhDs that work through Mexico, and they're studying specific environments. And there's one environment that they were looking into for many years now, and it's the Tamaulipas cloud forest. And a bunch of years ago, I'd say almost 15 years ago, a group of just 2 Tamaulipas cloud forest boas came in from a researcher doing research down there. And what he was finding out was, you know, this cloud forest had very unique fauna. Even the plants, the animals, the reptiles, everything was unique. Everything evolved there being a little different from their surroundings, you know. And since it's a cloud forest, they're genetically isolated because there's a very good microclimate for them to survive there. If they step out of the microclimate, they could be in a desert, they could be in an environment that's not conducive of surviving well. So these animals not only evolved in a particular place, it's almost like being in a sky island. You know, you're evolving on an island, but you're
Makes me think of like something like Avatar. You see the movie
yeah,
Avatar?
yeah, but yeah, you're attached to the mainland, but you're in a sky island that's a cloud forest. So I've been, you know, producing these Tamaulipas cloud forest boas for the last couple of years, and they've become pretty popular because they're small. They got pretty cool colors. It's hard to tell from the lighting here.
I know what I'm doing with my camera. We'll get some good shots.
Yeah, we'll photograph them afterwards, but. They're just cool snakes. Another thing that we figured out from these DNA sequencing is the snakes from this particular part of the world are called Boa Imperator now, not Boa Constrictor Imperator. But the snakes not very, very far from these, which are on the west coast of Mexico, are now Boa Sigma. And they differentiate from each other by almost 5%, meaning they've evolved separately for so long that, you know, you and I differentiate from a chimpanzee by less than 2%.
Right. So that's what I want.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say is 5%. Though it doesn't sound big. It's huge when it comes to.
So the boas from Mexico, from this part of the world, differentiate from the boas on the west side of their range by 5%. And now, DNA-wise, they call them Boa Sigma on the west side, and these are still Imperator. So to me, it's just a cool thing. You know, it's something for people to think about when they're looking at what kind of snake do I want? Do I want to preserve something that exists in the wild? Do I want to proliferate a morph that looks cool, which I do too, you know? So it's just a different example.
That was a nice segue into morphs that look cool. You got a couple more.
Well,
snakes
now
there.
I'm going to grab a morph, yeah. And you know, as you know, I've been working on Bloodbow.
Oh, right, yeah.
So Bloodbow is started for me as a locality because they came originally from El Salvador. And my good friend Ron St. Pierre, who's here this weekend, back in the early 90s, he was digging through bags of snakes in Strictly Reptile down in Florida, and he stumbled upon 4 or 5 of these little red snakes in a bag of wild-caught baby boas, you know? And he didn't pay much extra for them back then. They were like, oh, those are nice little red boas, you know? And he proved that they were a genetic recessive trait. You know, line bred them and proved them out. And that was, let's see, 25, almost 30 years ago. It's a long time ago. And I personally have been, over time, trying to make them redder and brighter and nicer for the pet trade, you know. So this is something that started as a locality passion that let's work on the color and see what we can get, you know. So this is at this point, I've been working on this, trying to get them, you know, nice and red for about 15 years now, and we've taken them, I think, to the next level by line breeding and selectively breeding. We added in hypo, which is an incomplete dominant trait, which also originated from Central America too. So they're still Central American boas. They're still Imperator. So this is like another example.
It's like a locality morph.
It's a locality
basically.
morph, and it's evolving in captivity. You know, we're changing it. You can leap hundreds, maybe thousands of years in evolution in captivity just by selectively breeding.
You're right there. You get to make the choice. They don't have to find each other in the forest.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like look what humans have done with cattle, pigs, dogs. You know, dogs look
Dogs
nothing
is a
like
crazy one, yeah.
their wild ancestors, which were basically wolves and African wild dogs.
Right.
You know, that's where dogs came from.
And
so
then you got Chihuahua or English Bulldog.
Yeah, the Chihuahua and a Mastiff. It's like, look, they're the same species.
Yeah, that's so wild.
Yeah. They're Canis familiaris. So that's another thing we're working on. And lastly, another locality boa that turned into a moth was the Leopard Boa, which originated from the Sonora Desert. Now, the Sonora Desert boa is that boa that's 5% different from the Tamaulipas cloud forest boa. The Sonora Desert boa is considered Boa sigma now. And that I go into detail in my book about how that came about. But the Leopard Boa was a boa that popped up in a normal breeding of Sonora Desert boas in Germany by Hans Winter. We just bred 2 Sonora boas together and popped up a Leopard Boa. And now here we are 20-something years later, and we're breeding them. I'm breeding them into Hypo Sonora, which is still keeping them Sonora. But we also added in the Hypo Salmon trait, which is the same trait we added into the Blood Boa. Because when we did it, we didn't know there was any such thing as a Sigma, Boa Sigma, but we still added in Hypo. And here we are evolving these snakes in captivity too. And they look nothing like they did the first time they popped up in Hans Winter's collection in, you know, the early 90s.
Right, right. It's pretty cool, man. I like your approach. It's a cool approach.
Yeah.
It definitely is.
Yeah. It's, you know, it's using science and common sense and passion to bring things together and to understand what you're doing, you know?
When, do you have an expectation of production or print publishing on that book?
We do. We're hoping for this fall.
Oh, sweet. Well,
Yeah.
That's coming right up.
Yeah, like I'm literally doing it right this minute. So for example, I'm sending chapters to the editor basically daily now. I'm taking the old book, extrapolating what was relevant.
It's going to remain relevant.
And will
in the new
still
book.
stay the same. Like the care section will stay the same. The breeding section might be tweaked a little bit, but it's pretty much the same. But
all the new illustrations and stuff? Or?
there's going to be mostly new pictures. We're going to add a lot of new pictures, yeah. And when I first did the book, we didn't put in all the pictures I wanted to because we were trying to keep it into a certain size, I guess. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to dig out some of those old pictures that I wanted to put in, and we'll put those back in, and maybe we'll make it more pictures in a bigger book. Because obviously, it's sold well. I think it's the only book that Eco had that's sold out. So,
Nice.
yeah.
It's awesome, man. It's always a pleasure talking to you, man.
Definitely, my brother.
It's such a good dude,
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, you heard that right. Vin's book, no longer in print, or out of print, or sold out basically, but new one coming in fall. So if you or a loved one is really into boa constrictors, then I'd be looking forward to that book coming out. And Vin, thank you again for coming on, man. Seriously, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Next week, we're going to be talking with Mr. Brandon Osborne and looking at his camo ball, and also he brought this really crazy looking hybrid snake. So if you're into that stuff too, well, you can stick around next week. And until then, you've been watching Triple B TV. Y'all take care.
I love it, man. It's awesome. There's so much value in everything you're saying.
Yeah, and you're archiving it, and like 20 years from now, people look at it and be like, oh, you know, Vin and Brian were talking about it on, you know, his show, stuff like that. People don't understand the value of archiving shit, because 100 years from now, people will be like, where'd the Leopard Boa come from? You know, it's archived here in a book, you know, because a lot of people don't understand. They don't. If people come up to me at shows and be like, where'd that come from? How did you make that? You know? The first one came from the wild, or it came out of wild caught snakes, you know?
Right.
The trait is there, it's hidden. I didn't do anything.
Ooh, hey, B-roll, B-roll. Hard work, I think. I don't work. I just play real hard.
That's right. So are we on camera?
I mean, not if you don't want to be. Hey Jesse, I'm at the booth. I'm doing my first interview though. Okay.
How's it going? Snapped it right at the neck.